So here we go. And there's a bunch of people we're missing that sent me apologies. I think some of them are concerned with the Ukraine and what they can do there. So anyway, but everybody gets the recording. So, we'll take it from there.
Did you hear from Stephen Kunstler?
Not yet, but I will see. So we're going to do two topics today. One is Christianity and Gnosticism for the first part. And then the second part was going to be much more on what I simply call the body electric. And the body electric is going to be much more science oriented. So let's get into this. We've got we have Christianity, which we've actually spent relatively little time on, but the reality of it is there appears to be someone named Jesus of Nazareth who was born and died, and once we stop there, everything else gets into disputes over what really happened. But anyway, he ended up leaving behind a set of disciples, and this led to the creation of what we call Christianity today, which is arguably the largest organized faith on earth. And so it has its own view of how these things happen. And if you go through Christianity, you'll see in 325 AD, there were apparently hundreds of different parishes floating around, each of them preaching different creeds, different things that were radically different when you looked at all of them. And so the Emperor Constantine convened
share that.
He convened a council in Nicaea, which is about 40 miles from Constantinople. And they came up with what is now the New Testament. And so there's a set of gospels there and some other things. And that was it. And this went on till we got to 1054 AD, when there was a big argument between the Archbishop of Rome and the Archbishop in Constantinople and in Antioch and in Alexandria. And basically the Archbishop of Rome excommunicated all the other archbishops, and the other archbishops reciprocated the favor by excommunicating the Archbishop in Rome. That's why this is called the Great Schism, creating the Roman Catholic faith and the Eastern Orthodox faith of Christianity, both of which are still there today. And then Christianity split with Martin Luther into Catholicism and Protestantism. And finally, we got to the Second Vatican Council in 1963, and they attempted to heal the schism, and that's been going on ever since. So the two sides are coming together. Well, while all of that's interesting, it turns out that there was something else that happened, which was instead of being this monolithic entity, it turns out that people discovered a bunch of writings, and there's a huge amount of literature available on this. So we just give you some examples, but the term Gnostic means knowledge. So the knowledge that we're talking about here is apparently that Jesus of Nazareth had things that he only taught to his disciples. That is secret knowledge, or knowledge, spiritual knowledge that is above and beyond what the masses got. And so in the Gospels, we see these parables, which are meant to be understood by everyone, but apparently there were things beyond that were hidden, that weren't shared, for right or for wrong. And then what goes with this, Gnosticism is knowledge, but it's spiritual knowledge. But what goes with this is then it was discovered that there were a whole bunch of other gospels besides the ones that were discovered that were in the New Testament. In fact, if you go to Wikipedia, you'll see there's on the order of 100 of these that were thrown out. They were not included in the New Testament. And it just goes on and on when you go look at these things. So we're just going to give you a little background on where these things came from And then we're going to go into two of these things in some detail to see what's going on. So the first thing is the Nag Hammadi library. And this is something that was discovered near the town of Nag Hammadi, which is, in Upper Egypt. So Upper Egypt, you have to remember that the Nile flows, all rivers flow downhill. So the Nile flows into the Mediterranean. So Upper Egypt is in the south. It's not in the north. Okay, so this is out in the middle of nowhere, and they discovered 13 leather-bound papyrus. They're called codices. So they were all in a sealed jar, and they ended up with something like 52 of these treatises, and these things are like completely new to people, and they're still there, and you can actually look at these things online on the internet. They were written in a variation of what is Egyptian, called Coptic, and people started studying these things. So it's a long time since 1945, but they've actually made a lot of progress in deciphering these things and trying to see what's going on, and that's what we're going to deal with here. Two examples of that. The manuscripts were apparently buried around between the 3rd and 4th centuries, which was roughly the time as this Council of Nicaea, and so none of these were included in the in the New Testament. So that's examples of these was the Gospel of Thomas, which is really not a gospel. There's just a bunch of sayings of things that Jesus of Nazareth or Christ said, and some of these are found. There's something like 80 of these that are found in the 4 Gospels that we're familiar with, but then there's another 40 or so that aren't found there. And so since they found a bunch of these within the existing Gospels, then that suggests that the other 40 are also valid and are brand new to what in the world Christ was talking about. And so it goes on and on. There's a particular individual, Valentinian or Valentine, who in the mid-2nd century actually collected a lot of these things together, and he called it the Gospel of Truth. This was thrown out for sure at the Council of Nicaea when you dig into this. We're not going to spend any time on these, and I'm just trying to show you the variety of these things. The Gospel of Mary is for Mary Magdalene, Mary of Magdalena, and she was the one that was apparently closest to Jesus. The Gospel of Judas is what we are going to go through. It's a complete rewrite of what Judas was. We were taught, if you're raised as a Christian, that Judas was this incredible traitor that sold Jesus to the Romans for 30 pieces of silver. And this shows there was another side to the story that we somehow missed. And so it goes. There's a second source for these things, which is called the Dead Sea Scrolls. Qumran is by the Dead Sea, and there's some caves there. And in 1946-47, some people found these scrolls, of which there's many scrolls. What are you doing?
I just want to see who else came. Keep
What are you doing?
Don't stop.
Okay, and so the scrolls are all in this museum in Israel, in Jerusalem. But I believe you can. I went and looked, and I think you can actually look at the fragments of these on the internet. They have pictures of these things everywhere. And Qumran is where there was a group there in roughly 70 AD. They were very mystical, and they called themselves zealots. And they were the ones that decided to escape when the Romans came in and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem and sold everybody into slavery. And they went to Masada, and they were holed up there, and the Romans came there and built a ramp up to the top of Masada. If you ever go to Israel, I encourage you to go do this. It's totally mind-boggling. And of course, the Romans built a ramp with the slaves that they got out of Jerusalem. So the ramp went up to the top, and when the zealots were there, they would try and knock off some of the people building the ramp. And of course, that just led the Romans to get more Jews to go help build this thing. So eventually they made it up to the top. The zealots could see it was all over, and they all committed suicide, which is where we get the phrase, they're zealots in what they believe. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are a second set of materials that we draw on this. The Nag Hammadi actually was published. Carl Jung, who we're going to deal with shortly, ended up funding a lot of the publication of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, and the Dead Sea Scrolls are really in much worse shape. They're just some of these things are just absolutely just fragments or shreds of parchments that we see there, and they're written in all kinds of different languages that we have here. People gone crazy trying to read these things and translate them to get anywhere. But there's a total of 225 of these biblical texts, which when you look at everything that are there, and again, none of this is in the New Testament. It's just all completely different from this. So that's what we're going to cover here, what got thrown out. And just again, for equal time, we talked about Christianity here, and the four Gospels that we're talking about, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were the ones that were kept. Having said that, there were a lot of non-Jews out there, and that's where Paul, or Saul of Tarsus, comes in. He never met Jesus, but he had a vision on the road, apparently going to Damascus, and he ended up being the one that preached to the Gentiles. There's many more Gentiles than there were Jews all over the Mediterranean, and eventually ended up going into Rome, where he and Peter, or Simon, were both killed by the Romans, crucified. So this is just touching on this split here that came up. You're all going to get this. And so we have the Catholic Church, which is 1.3 billion, 920 million apparently in all the different Protestant faiths, 230 million in the Eastern Orthodox. This includes, Russia and the Ukraine. And then in the Orient, there's one of the disciples of Jesus actually went to India. And so there's a whole Christian activity in India. So the Gnostic materials, the main difference to take away from this is that the Gnostic view of the world viewed material existence as basically flawed or evil. Okay, that in fact there was a hidden God and a malevolent lesser divinity who was associated with the Yahweh of the Old Testament, and that person really ended up creating the flawed world that we see around us, that leads to the suffering that people go through. This is simply what was preached here at that time. And so there's really not concepts of sin and repentance, but there's the concepts of there's an illusion that there's really a better world that's beyond the one that's flawed there. And there's a notion of enlightenment, that you can sense that much better world that's out there. It's not the one that we're in here. So there was, again, a huge amount of activity with these that all of this got buried with the Council of Nicaea, as I mentioned, in 325. This just ended. In fact, the people that were dealing with this sort of stuff had a following that was led by an Egyptian called Arius, and the winning side was led by someone called Athanasius, who was also Egyptian. And Athanasius, having won, having said that Jesus of Nazareth was in fact not simply the Messiah, but was God himself, they decided to take it upon themselves over the next 100 years to butcher everyone who felt otherwise. So this led to all of the followers of Arian being massacred, which is why we don't hear about this. The other thing that happened with it was there was, for example, any pagan temple that was out there. So this is when in 392, the library in Alexandria was burned. That had apparently hundreds of thousands of scrolls and parchments from who knows where. And all of this was burned in the name of, it didn't follow what came out of the Council of Nicaea, which is why we don't ever hear about this stuff. It's a miracle that we know anything at all, quite frankly. So we're going to talk about the Apocryphon of John, but I'm just going to skip through this here because I have a nice little YouTube video to do it. The thing to take away from this is a very different story of the creation. Okay, this is not the creation that we saw where there was let there be light and there was light, and then 7 days later the world was there. This is not that story at all. It's a completely different story. So we'll let the YouTube video go through it to describe all these things. And there is a God there, but there's a different story for Adam and Eve here that comes up. And you have Cain and Abel here, and so forth. But what I'm going to go to is the Gospel of Judas, and then we're going to go back to the YouTube video. So what Christianity had portrayed Judas as was just a tragic hero. The Gospel of Judas actually portrays him as a tragic hero rather than simply being the classic betrayer of Jesus of Nazareth. So Jesus was meeting with his disciples and it was ended up he asked Judas the following question: would you follow a God that is not my God? Okay. And the disciples were all upset at being asked this question, and Jesus challenged them to step forth if they represent this perfect human being that follows the God that is not the God of Jesus. But none of them knew what to do. All of a sudden, Judas stepped forth, and he said that he realized that Jesus is a partner of Barbella, which is the God that we'll see in the new origin story that I just skipped over. But Judas is not worthy to speak the name of the one that sent Jesus. Okay. And so Jesus went ahead and revealed more of this cosmic order to Judas, including all kinds of other creatures, which are called eons, which is unfortunate because these are not years. These are actual creatures, and the creation myth of Adam, and there was a Seth in there, but this is different from the one that you'll find in the Bible, and on and on. Okay. And despite all this, the Old Testament God, which is Yahweh, is in fact inferior or only partially divine. And the only true God is the one who lives in the eternal realm that's separate from humanity in the physical world. And this is what Jesus had taught to Judas. Now, Judas was given all this knowledge, and Jesus told him, I will tell you the mysteries of the kingdom, not so that you'll go there, but so that you will be much aggrieved of this. In the New Testament, the salvation that people see comes into the world through the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, which was facilitated by Judas betraying Jesus to the Romans, all of which Jesus foretold before this happened. And so Judas gave Jesus over to the Romans and then suffered, and apparently in some stories commit suicide. In the Gnostic gospel, Jesus says to Judas, you'll receive some sort of divine reward for playing this role you did in betraying me, and that he's meant to sacrifice the human being with whom Jesus dwells, not the divine savior, not his soul. And this sets off a chain of events that will eventually release the physical world from its inferiority. And Judas will be there up in the heavens as one of the key players at the end of all this. Totally different story. None of this is there in our modern canon. So I'm going to just skip now. Hold on one sec. I'm going to go to, oops, screen sharing stopped. Okay. So I'm going to go here to our video, which I think is this. And we're going to go through what's called the Apocryphon of John, the secret book of John, the secret writings of John. And you can judge for yourself what got left out here. This would be an example of a gospel, of a set of beliefs that were taught up to the Council of Nicaea all around the Mediterranean.
First glance, rather puzzling.
Oh, wait, I forgot to do screen share. Hold on one sec. No, we're in screen share. People, right, we're okay. Here we go.
A copy of the Nag Hammadi library and Eyre the Meyer or the Robinson edition won't be confronted with hundreds of pages.
Can everybody hear this?
No real idea where to begin studying it. Some titles seem vaguely familiar, like the prayer of the Apostle Paul, or the various Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, Philip, or Mary,
Better?
or perhaps even the Acts of Peter. While other texts appear downright strange, like the discourse of the Ogdoad to the Ennead or the trimorphic Protanoia. Yeah, trimorphic Protanoia, completely clear. And of course, that's not to mention that many of these texts are filled with long, complicated, and obscure mythologies, words that are incredibly unusual, long strings of vowels for some reason, and many texts are sadly mere fragments. It's honestly overwhelming, and it's very natural to ask, where in the world do I begin studying this vast corpus that we now call Gnostic literature? In this episode of Esoterica, I want to offer an answer to just that question. In my opinion, the best place to start studying Gnostic literature is a text called the Secret Book of John, or sometimes referred to as the Apocryphon of John. Now, while the Apocryphon of John is, at least in my opinion, one of the best places to start studying Gnostic literature, that doesn't at all indicate that it's going to be a walk in the park. However, I think by studying the Apocryphon of John rather closely, one does get some appreciation of what we might call Gnostic mythology and the overall tenor of the kind of literature that one might encounter in something like the Nag Hammadi library or the Bruce Codex. Further, I think by studying the Apocryphon of John, one does get some sense of the overall tenor of what we might call Gnostic Christianity. Although again, I have to say that with some degree of caveats. Also, I think what's interesting about the Apocryphon of John is that it disrupts some of the stereotypes often grouped with the idea of Gnosticism. So I hope you'll join me as we explore the secret book of John, or the Apocryphon of John, a foundational text of what scholars now refer to as Gnosticism. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion. As you may know, Gnosticism is a bit of a fraught category in the academic study of religion these days. While it's popularly held that there existed an ancient religion called Gnosticism, of which there were Jewish, Christian, and even later Islamic variants, that very category, Gnosticism, has come under sustained academic attack in the past several years. So much so that there's a very strong scholarly current which rejects the existence of a historical religion called Gnosticism and basically claims that there were no such thing as Gnostics. They were simply Christians that had a very specific way of doing Christianity that we now, as scholars, call Gnostic, but they themselves, in fact, never refer to themselves as such. Now, I think this is an incredibly important debate, and understanding just what we refer to when we call something Gnostic is an incredibly important part of academic scholarship on the history of religions. And I'm going to cover that debate in a future episode. With that debate in mind, I just want to say that I'm going to be using the term Gnosticism and Gnostic quite provisionally through the course of our exploration of the Apocryphon of John. And typically when I'm using those words, I'm using them somewhat under the rubric developed by Vanderbroek, which is currently on the screen. I'll talk about his book toward the end of the episode and why I think his introduction to Gnosticism is one of the best out there. So stay tuned to the end to learn more about that. With that caveat in place, we can ask the question, what is the Apocryphon, or the secret book of John? Well, simply put, it's a kind of gospel. That is to say, a text providing good news about the salvation of human beings. While the typical Gospels of the New Testament take the form of biographies of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the Apocryphon of John is rather different. In fact, it acts as a kind of continuation of the Gospel of John found in the New Testament. Here, in what appears to be the period after the resurrection of Jesus, John the Apostle is being taunted by a Pharisee about the very teachings of Jesus. Distraught, John actually retreats into the desert, and it's there that the sky is torn asunder and the resurrected Jesus provides John a secret teaching. That secret teaching, or apocryphon, revealed to John by the resurrected divine Jesus, is the subject of the text we'll be exploring today. But before turning to the contents of the Apocryphon of John, let's talk about the text itself. It actually survives in a whopping 4 Coptic manuscripts that date from roughly the 3rd to the 5th centuries. As you may know, Coptic is the final form of the ancient Egyptian language, originally written in hieroglyphics, but eventually translated into various other scripts, including hieratic and demotic, and eventually being written in the Greek script. So basically, Coptic is the Egyptian language being written in the Greek script, with a couple of extra letters thrown in from the demotic alphabet. Now, I know that 4 manuscripts doesn't sound like a lot, but when you consider that virtually no intact canonical gospel manuscripts survive from this same period, along with very few copies of the Iliad and Odyssey, one is confronted with the reality that it's positively shocking that 4 independent copies of the Apocryphon of John survive from late classical antiquity. Further, it seems like the text was originally written in Greek and then translated multiple times into Coptic. We have slight dialectical differences in the translations that have survived into Coptic. Now, the fact that the text has been translated from Greek into Coptic several times tells us that there was some demand for people to read this text in their indigenous language, the language of Egypt, which tells us that the text was quite popular. The text itself survives in 2 different recensions, a longer and shorter version. The longer version includes a long list of demons that are responsible for the construction of the primordial Adam, taken from an alleged book of Zoroaster, along with a hymn of providence or pronoia, which I'll talk about later, appended to the very end of the text. It's also worth noting that the various versions of the Apocryphon of John don't always exactly agree. For instance, in the Berlin Codex, which was discovered in the 19th century, there's an important note that the distinction between men and women, specifically the subordination of women to men, was actually instituted by the hideous pseudo-god Yaldabaoth. And so in that version, we have a very interesting idea that patriarchy itself is an unjust form of social relation instituted by a false god. A not minor point if you're, a woman. So if you want to study the Apocryphon of John very closely, you'll want to do a kind of comparative analysis of the various versions that survive. I'll talk about those different versions toward the end and where you can study them each independently or together synoptically if you choose. So let's turn to the question of how to date the Apocryphon of John, which is challenging. The shorter recension of the Apocryphon of John is typically thought by scholars to be the earlier version, and there are even a current among scholarship to take that the framing device using the Apostle John is in fact later accretion onto an earlier, perhaps even pre-Christian Gnostic text. So that the core of the text is perhaps the earliest section, and then there is a kind of Christian bookend put on at the beginning and the end, although there's a lot of debate about just the degree to which that's true. The earliest discussion of what we take to be the contents of the text can be found on the detection and the overthrow of so-called knowledge, or gnosis. This text is typically referred to in the Latin as Adversus Haereres, and it was written by the Proto-Orthodox bishop Irenaeus sometime around 180 of the Common Era. Now, this all points to a very important factor in thinking about the popularity of the Apocryphon of John: location. What's really fascinating about the fact that the 4 Coptic manuscripts that survive were likely produced in Egypt, what's interesting is that we have Irenaeus writing his book against the Apocryphon of John all the way over in Gaul, what is now France. The fact that 4 different manuscripts have survived, and the fact that Irenaeus attacks the text with such vigor, tells us, given the geographic range of the text being found in France all the way to Egypt, and the fact that he feels the need to attack it with such vigor, tells us that this text was in fact rather popular. So while the Apocryphon of John was not authoritative through the entire rise and development of Christianity through the ages, there's no doubt that at least in this very early period that the text was very popular and widely read. So as I mentioned earlier, the very core of the text may even predate Christianity. We have a rough idea for when the text of the Apocryphon of John was produced as we know it. The Gospel of John we typically think was composed sometime around 100 of the Common Era, and if we have Irenaeus arguing against the Apocryphon of John around 180 or 185 of the Common Era, so it makes some sense that the version of the Apocryphon of John, perhaps as we know it, was being composed sometime between roughly 100 of the Common Era and 185, around the time perhaps that Irenaeus begins to argue against it. Now, the Coptic translations which have actually survived to this day probably date to a much later period, perhaps the 3rd century. In fact, when we look at the Nag Hammadi library, inside of the cartonnage of some of those codices, the cartonnage is simply the packing material that's used to make the covers a bit stronger, there's actually a date, several dates in fact, inside of the cartonnage of those codices, and the latest date there is 348 of the Common Era. So that gives us a rough sense about when the Coptic text would have been produced and when the Apocryphon of John, at least as we know it in the Coptic editions that survive, would have been produced. There's also some good reason to believe that the Berlin Codex, the one discovered in the 19th century, actually the first manuscript discovered of the Apocryphon of John, actually dates to a slightly later period. But again, if one wants to study the Apocryphon of John in all of its various versions and all of its various recensions, it's going to be very important to study all 4 manuscripts and their translations, if that's possible. Now, if you think the question of when the Apocryphon of John is vexing, just wait till we get to who wrote it. That is the really difficult question to answer. As I mentioned earlier, the core mythological section of the text may in fact be pre-Christian. There are elements of Middle Platonic philosophy along with Jewish mythology we found in that central text. Now, of course, this is perplexing because if you read the text, it's very clear that the author of the text does not like the Israelite God of Genesis. In fact, that God is not a God at all in the Apocryphon of John. It's a kind of pseudo-God, evil, malevolent entity. So the writer of the text certainly knows some Jewish literature. They might even be Jewish, although their relationship with Judaism is, well, let's call it complicated. The kind of literary, philosophical, and religious sophistication of the text points in the direction of somewhere like Alexandria in Egypt. It's there that we have a highly syncretistic community of intellectual pursuits, ranging from everything from the indigenous traditional religion of Egypt through Judaism to Hermeticism and a wide variety of philosophical movements, including Middle Platonism and Stoicism. However, the text as we have it now is eminently Christian, and I really want to put a very fine point on this. The people that wrote, edited, and composed the text as we know it would have identified primarily as Christian, much more so as Christian than, for instance, as Gnostic. And that's part of the reason why, by the way, This term, Gnostic and Gnosticism, has come under scholarly criticism in recent years. The fact that we refer to these texts as Gnostic should not in any way overshadow the fact that the people who took these teachings to be authoritative and salvific were fundamentally pious Christians. While Orthodox Christianity was the one that ultimately won the day, so to speak, that shouldn't at all diminish this fact. These texts were being read and studied for their salvific value by Christians. So it's clear that the version of the Apocryphon of John that survived, the one that we have in the various 4 manuscripts that have come down to us, are fundamentally Christian texts, even though they may be composed of pre-Christian or para-Christian literatures that have been edited together into one volume. But regardless, that's about all we can say about who wrote it. It seems to be composed of several different volumes in a highly educated intellectual and spiritual milieu, perhaps Alexandria, by a community of Christians who are looking to text and teaching like this for their salvific character. So, just what is a salvific secret teaching to be found in the Apocryphon of John? Well, let me begin by saying that any attempt to summarize this text is going to basically fail. Every single sentence in this text is so packed with information that it's going to be impossible for me to accurately summarize the teachings of this text. There's simply no substitution for you go and studying the text yourself. However, I'm going to venture the impossible and try to summarize this incredibly difficult text. The text begins with a kind of negative theological account of an utterly transcendent alien God, who through knowing itself produces a secondary being called the Barbello, which is what Barbello means is incredibly mysterious. With the combination of the ineffable ultimate Father God and the Mother Barbello God, a third kind of being is produced, and that is the divine Christ, or autogenes, the self-created one. Further semi-divine entities emanate or flow from the relationship of the transcendent Father, the Mother, and the divine Christ in the form of syzygies, or pairs, and these various pairs are typically attendant to either the Barbello or Christ. Altogether, these syzygies, along with the divine trinity of the transcendent Father, the Barbello, and the Christ, form the pleroma, or the divine fullness. This fullness is populated by a range of divine beings or semi-divine beings called aeons, and the last of those aeons to be produced is wisdom in the form of Sophia. Sophia, or divine wisdom, seeks to emulate the Father and desires to create things on her own, and her desire to create things without the consent of her partner aeon produces a kind of cosmic disaster. From this unbalanced desire emerges a hideous, nightmarish entity referred to as Yaldabaoth. Exactly what Yaldabaoth means is a bit clear. I tend to think that it may come from a phrase coming from Hebrew, something like Yeled Bohu, which might mean something like the child of chaos. At any rate, this hideous monstrosity is expelled from the pleroma by Sophia and is sort of alone on its own. Now, because this hideous entity has some amount of divine power in it, and because it has a vague memory of being in the pleroma, the fullness of the divine world, it seeks to create its own kind of micro-pleroma, or its own kind of universe. And that universe it creates is a kind of inversion of the pleroma, and Yaldabaoth then proceeds to populate that inverted reality with all kinds of demonic entities. These demonic entities include a wide range of rather nasty beings, including the archons, or the leaders of the cosmic world, and these are typically identified with the various kinds of celestial bodies. And it's here in the text, with this cosmic disaster of Sophia producing Yaldabaoth, and Yaldabaoth creating this kind of inverted, horrifying reality, that the text of the Apocryphon of John really begins to show its genius by re-spinning the original Genesis creation story to be found in the Hebrew Bible and the Torah, by showing that the God of that creation story, the God of Genesis, is in fact none other than the nightmarish entity known as Yaldabaoth, the child of chaos. It's at this point in the secret teaching that Yaldabaoth declares that itself is basically the only God. It says, I am a jealous God, there are none other before me, only to be immediately corrected from the pleroma itself, which says, hey, look, you're not the only thing. There is this other thing that exists, a human being. And this human being from the pleroma is actually reflected in some sense in the nightmarish, chaotic waters of the primordial creation of Yaldabaoth. After seeing the divine primordial man reflected in those initial chaotic waters, Yaldabaoth and its various demons attempt to create a kind of psychic copy of that Adam, or that human being. However, they fail to actually animate the being. And this is where the Mother Father, or Barbello, along with the Transcendent Father, actually tricks Yaldabaoth into breathing in some of its latent divinity into the primordial Adam, or the primordial human being, thus animating it in some sense, tricking Yaldabaoth and transferring some of its power, which again originally comes from the divine realm via Sophia, into the divine human being. It's then that Yaldabaoth realizes that it's been tricked and actually cast the psychic body of the Adam, the divine human being, into the furthest depths of matter. In fact, it cast the first human being into a kind of garden of delight. The word Eden, from Garden of Eden, actually means delight. And in the Apocryphon of John, the Garden of Eden is actually meant to be a physical trap in which physical pleasure, specifically the pleasures of the body, are meant to forever trap the body, the psychic body, and the physical body of Adam in this garden. So the Garden of Eden itself is not meant to be a paradise, according to the Apocryphon of John, but a kind of prison. At the moment of being cast down into this physical prison of the Garden of Eden, the divine transcendent Father takes pity on the primordial human being and places inside of them a kind of divine being, epinoia, which will later allow them to reach salvation. Of course, this enrages Yaldabaoth, and Yaldabaoth attempts to cut into the physical body of the Adam to extract epinoia. Of course, epinoia has already fled back in the divine realm, and it's in that process that Yaldabaoth actually creates a kind of physical double of epinoia in the form of life, or Chava, our word that gets translated as Eve. So Eve is a kind of physical mirror, in some sense, of the divine epinoia. Of course, the Apocryphon of John continues to riff in this really amazing way on the Genesis creation story, where in the Genesis creation story, the human beings are told not to eat of the tree of knowledge. And when they eat of the tree of knowledge, it actually condemns them for having rebelled against God. However, in the Apocryphon of John, it is precisely because that they disobey Yaldabaoth, they eat from the tree of knowledge, that they gain understanding of their plight. And it is there that they can begin the process of working toward their own salvation, escaping the prison that is the Garden of Eden, and eventually making their way back to the divine pleroma. So in the Apocryphon of John, the Garden of Eden story is not a fall from grace, but it is in fact a kind of a liberation, or at least the process, the start of a liberation from the prison of the physical world back into the divine pleroma. After their expulsion from the garden, Yaldabaoth actually sexually assaults Chava, or life. This produces two demonic entities which rule over the physical human body. These roughly correlate to Cain and Abel. Despite these demonic powers ruling over the physical body, Adam, the primordial human being, and Chava, life, do engage in sexual intercourse and produce a son, Seth. And it is Seth, produced through their conjunction, is the spiritual ancestor of all those that achieve knowledge about the truth of the physical reality. And thus, in some sense, Seth is the line through which this type of epinoia, or this type of salvific knowledge, is going to flow. Seth, in some sense, becomes the spiritual heir of all Gnostics. In fact, this type of Gnosticism is sometimes referred to as Sethian Gnosticism, for this emphasis on the character of Seth. It's here in the text that John actually interrupts the ongoing revelation from Jesus to ask about the ultimate fate of the salvation history of all human beings. And there's good news. I mean, it's a gospel. And the good news, and again, this is incredibly interesting, given the fact that we typically think of Gnosticism as being rather pessimistic. The good news is that basically everyone, all of mankind, is going to eventually achieve this kind of salvific knowledge. The only people that will ultimately be condemned are those that achieve Gnosis and then betray it or abandon it. According to the Apocryphon of John, basically everyone is eventually going to reach salvation. Again, the only kind of people that won't are those that achieve Gnosis and then betray it. Of course, Yaldabaoth isn't done with human beings yet. It attempts to wipe out all of human beings through the institution of fate, which can be resisted through spiritual powers. It attempts to destroy the line of Seth with a catastrophic flood, which the luminous Epinoia actually informs Noah about. And eventually it institutes these demonic entities falling to the earth and mating with human women, somehow tempt human beings, although it's not exactly clear. Of course, this is the reference to the infamous Nephilim to be found in Genesis 6, but of course also spelled out in much greater detail in the Book of the Watchers, or the first book of Enoch. Following the description of the Nephilim, there's a kind of abrupt break where there appears the hymn of Pronoia. Now again, exactly how this hymn of Pronoia fits with the rest of the text isn't clear. Many scholars think that the hymn of the Pronoia, or divine providence, is actually an earlier document that is fused onto the end of the Apocryphon of John. However, what we have is a story in which the Pronoia has descended 3 times into this sort of chaotic abyss of physical reality, and it is only on the 3rd occasion that the Pronoia was able to awaken human beings from their ignorance and thus begin the process of salvation. It is in fact in that 3rd awakening that Pronoia baptizes humankind with a kind of 5-fold baptism, inaugurating the process of their salvation. If you're interested, I've actually made a separate video from another Gnostic text in which that baptism, or a baptism somewhat like it, it's a 3-fold baptism as opposed to a 5-fold baptism, but I've made another video in which Gnostic baptism rituals are actually described at some length. So if you're interested in the ritual side of Gnostic Christianity, you may want to check out my episode on Gnostic baptism rituals. However, it's still not clear exactly how this final hymn of the Pronoia fits exactly with the rest of the Apocryphon of John. However, scholars have detected something very interesting about the long recension of the Apocryphon of John. It seems that the 3-fold cycle of the hymn of the Pronoia has actually influenced exactly the way that the long recension has been restructured over and against the shorter recension. It seems that the short recension may have been edited into its final form, or at least the form we have in the long recension, along the lines of the hymn of the Pronoia, where the hymn of the Pronoia is somehow imposing its 3-fold structure onto the Apocryphon of John itself. Although exactly how all that works out is a bit mysterious, I'll include a great study about just this topic in the description below if you're interested. Needless to say, the Apocryphon of John is a mythological tour de force and contains many of the elements that are typically thought to be Gnostic. Though I want to point out something that I think is very important in any discussion of the Apocryphon of John. While the Apocryphon of John is a really important surviving mythological story found in Gnostic Christianity, it is by no means the only form of this kind of myth. In fact, there's another version of exactly this myth that we found in the Holy Book of the Great Invisible Spirit, sometimes referred to as the Gospel of the Egyptians. So even the version of this myth with the Barbelo cycle and the Sethianism is not exhausted by the Apocryphon of John. There are other versions of this myth. And further, there are other versions of early Christian mythology that we would now call Gnostic, for instance, that of Valentinus, that can be found in the Gospel of Truth. In the Valentinian mythology, to be found again in the Gospel of Truth, is an entirely different mythological structure. In fact, it leans much more heavily on Middle Platonism than does this Barbelo mysticism, which seems to be at least distantly Jewish in character. So while the mythology developed in the Apocryphon of John is incredibly important for understanding the development of what we might call Gnostic Christianity in the ancient world, one should not confuse this form of mythology with all of Gnostic mythology at all. Further, you'll notice that I use the word Gnostic in a rather provisional way throughout this episode. That's because even by studying a text like the Apocryphon of John, which is taken to be typically Gnostic by many people, if you study the text carefully, it actually disrupts many of the stereotypes that one often has about Gnosticism. For instance, it's often thought that Gnosticism is radically dualistic with a deep hatred of the physical world, including the physical body, and that extends into a kind of radical asceticism, especially downplaying sexuality. But that's simply not true if we study the Apocryphon of John rather closely. Of course, the physical world is thought to be fundamentally evil, but notice that the primordial human being, along with Chava, or life, actually only are able to persist by having sexual intercourse and producing Seth, and it's only by the production of Seth that the epinoia, the salvific knowledge that one can reach through Gnostic religion, is actually passed down through the ages, reaching eventually maybe people like us. Again, while the physical world is thought by the Apocryphon of John to be fundamentally a kind of prison, it's actually through sexual intercourse that the epinoia is passed down, such that all of later people can actually reach Gnosis and escape it. So we have a kind of tension where there is a kind of anti-physical dualism operating here, but at the same time, it does not by extension logically lead to a kind of anti-body, radical, anti-sexual intercourse asceticism. And as you can see, by carefully studying a text like the Apocryphon of John, many of these simplistic ideas like dualism, hatred of the body, anti-physicality, these kinds of ideas break down or at least become very problematic if you study these texts very closely. And this is why scholars have increasingly thought to think about Gnosticism as a much more complex kind of interplay of ideas rather than a body of intellectual or spiritual beliefs held by people in antiquity. Now, before I make an episode specifically detailing the criticisms of the concept of Gnosticism, I want to make a few more episodes covering some of these texts, because you can't really criticize a category without laying that category out, at least in some detail. So in some sense, I'm trying to balance out two competing elements while making these episodes on Gnosticism. I'm laying out Gnostic ideas and Gnostic texts, but while saying that modern scholars are pretty skeptical of these categories. So we have to hold both of these at the same time if we want to treat this material in a responsible way. Another and perhaps final thing worth pointing out about the Apocryphon of John is to notice just how radically advanced of a theological text this is, given its position in the development of Christianity. If we date this text to between 100 and 185 of the Common Era, it is positively shocking how much ground this text covers. Here we have a highly developed negative theology, a very complex economy of the inner life and development of the Godhead, an explanation of the profusion of heavenly entities, including Christ, along with an origin story about the very nature of evil itself. We have an interesting account of why there's a physical world at all. How did the physical world get here if everything began as a spiritual world? And further, we're given an incredibly epic story about just how that physical world can be escaped. And finally, there's this amazing hymn of the pronoia, which describes the structure of that salvation being played out through history. I mean, this is incredible. The Apocryphon of John covers an enormous array of philosophical, spiritual, and salvific ideas. It's a positive tour de force. And again, if we date this text to around 100 to 180 of the Common Era, this is decisively before the rise of the great Christian theologians, people like Athanasius. So this text, if it is from that early time period, is incredibly advanced from a philosophical, spiritual, and Christological viewpoint. And while the Apocryphon of John is intellectually dense and theologically complex, it's also worth noting just how hopeful the text is. The story is all about how a cosmic mistake is corrected and how human beings can achieve salvation, maybe even all human beings at some level. Notice that the text is incredibly hopeful. And again, this disrupts some of the ideas that people typically ascribe to so-called Gnosticism, with its obsession of the evil of physicality or the horrifying nightmarish Yaldabaoth. This text is fundamentally about hope, and it ends again with the hymn of the pronoia on exactly that positive note. This text is amazingly hopeful, again disrupting some of the more stereotypical ideas that are typically ascribed to so-called Gnosticism. And it's for all these reasons that I've listed and more that I really do think that the Apocryphon of John, or the secret teaching of John, is the absolute best place for a person to begin their study of Gnosticism and Gnostic literature. You get a solid overall sense of the Gnostic myth structure. You get a very detailed theory of salvation, along with some of the more subtle aspects that also go to disrupt the category of Gnosticism itself. So this text allows you to get an entryway into the very complex theology of Gnosticism and also begin the process of undermining that concept at the same time. It's incredibly dynamic if you give it a very careful study. If you're interested in Gnosticism, Hermetic philosophy, or mystical theology, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica. These are all core content items on our channel. And further, if you want to support my work of making accessible, scholarly, and free.
So we're going to break there and switch over to our next topic. But I wanted to just stop and ask, this is just trying to give you an exposure to, remember, there is a handout where I went through and summarized in a different way what he was saying. Any comments on any of this from anybody?
Good thing there's not going to be a quiz. I'm going to have to go back and look at that again. Here's Harry.
Okay, we'll give you a recording. You can go look at it again as much as you want.
I want to say I just loved seeing all those illustrations of William Blake
Yeah,
in one place, and they seemed so evocative of what was being said. And Carl Jung considered himself to be a Gnostic, very seriously. He was somewhat closeted. He wasn't always open about it, but I've seen pictures of him wearing a fez, and he was often asked whether he believed in God and whether he believed that Jesus was God. And he said, "I don't believe, I know." Which is just very interesting for somebody with such a magnificent intellect and, so steeped in world religion and traditions of every stripe. He was deeply that we are all here too.
yeah.
That was from Nina. I was
Yeah,
thinking of
yeah.
Nina during this.
Yeah.
Who's another Buddhist, by the way. But for me, it just whet my appetite for more. I want to continue.
There's a
look
lot
into
of, again, source material here, because again, this is based on these things that were discovered in the 1945 timeframe, but people didn't know where to start. There was no framework for these things because they just appeared out of nowhere, and translating them
And Jung was consulted about them and contributed to, there was a lot of fundraising going on to export them and preserve them and translate them and so on. And he was involved in all of that. So he wasn't saying these things lightly or superficially. I've read more interpretations subsequent to that period than I have of that, the original sources, which is the way to go, really, I think. But I personally, I think it's fascinating. And Blake is one of my absolute favorite poets and writers. And Jung is probably, right up there. So.
Okay, so we're going to go on to our second topic, which is
Can I ask you something?
Yeah, go ahead.
So this one went by a little fast for me. My takeaway here was that the Judeo-Christian God is considered a pseudo-God, an evil, false God, that there is a greater benevolent power, but this God is a malevolent actor. Is that the takeaway there?
Yeah, you'll see in the handout. Let me get out of this Okay, and let me go back to the handout.
From what I've
Hold on,
read,
okay.
it was considered to be kind of a child god. And he wasn't supposed to be given the power of creation. That was a mistake. And he created this universe and this life that a lot of us feel caught in by mistake. And it wasn't, it wasn't clear whether it should be destroyed or allowed to continue. But it was allowed to continue. But he was chastised for, he was like a bad little kid,
Yeah,
doing a science experiment in his room that got away from him.
yeah. The thing, it's in the handout. I unfortunately just closed it, but basically, there are these entities that themselves are in this pleroma he talked about, a father, a mother, and Jesus, the three of them. And then coming out of that, there was an entity which was called Yao Daboth, which you'll see. So he didn't inherit everything that they had, was the problem. He had a flawed view. They had a more holistic view of things. And then when he went ahead to create the world, the universe, he had his flawed view. So the universe was flawed in doing this. And then he created flawed people as a result. Okay. And so that's what you'll see here is everything is slightly out of focus, or with every succeeding spin-off, it's just not done right. And that's your takeaway here. You'll see it in the handout. I tried to summarize all of what you're talking about in the handout so that there's no confusion, but that's the basic idea. And
it's not a new idea.
No.
I mean,
No.
people have been saying this, that to me, that's the really
Yeah,
interesting.
so
thing.
you have the gist of it.
Is Sophia the mother here in this, father and mother?
Well, they created these three entities, created four what he called eons, Aeons. So there are 12 of these aeons, of which one of them, the very last one, is Sophia, who represents wisdom. Okay, and we touched on this earlier when we were going through Sophia Pistis, which is a different book. Again, something that got suppressed, dropped, whatever. But Sophia is again passing this wisdom on to the offspring, which are mankind or womankind.
And what is Jesus's relationship to these eons?
Jesus apparently is one of the three in the original cluster with the one. There's the one, and then there's this other entity, and then there's Jesus, and they're all together make up this pleroma, which is the highest entity.
This malevolent being is a fourth entity.
Yes, yeah, that's right. They created
An offspring.
an offspring, Yao Daboth, whose name is remarkably similar to Yahweh. And then this Yao Daboth created the universe, created what we see around us.
And this would be sibling to Jesus?
And to the three, yeah.
Or they're
An offspring,
misbegotten
an offspring,
child.
yeah.
Well, I thought you were saying that Jesus was the offspring.
No. He was there at the get-go. So this is also what came up with the church in Rome, felt that Jesus was on the same level as God, and the church in Constantinople felt that Jesus was not, and that led to the schism that I talked about.
Is the Trinity supposed to be this?
The different kind of Trinity.
It's a different sort of Trinity.
Right.
Okay, it's not what you think, but there is this entity called the One, who's above it all, and the Savior and they is clearly Jesus.
But
is
I
there.
think it's better to say the Christos than Jesus,
Right, Christos or Messiah, but Christos.
the spirit,
Yeah,
not the person in Israel.
right.
That it may or may not have incarnated into, like an avatar kind of way. It apparently descended into human form, but it was part of this original Trinity, which
And who,
you look at the tree of life in Kabbalah, it's very parallel to that. There's the 1, 2, 3 up at the top. So
Right.
it's very abstract. It's not a person. It's more like and Sophia wasn't really a person.
She was an offspring. One of these 12 aeons that were the offspring of this pleroma.
okay, but you have the one, you have Christos, and what is the third entity?
Well, I would say Sophia.
No,
And
it's not Sophia. I'll have to go back, and I shouldn't have shut my slide deck. I have it all here.
I think the Holy Spirit in the Christian Trinity
Let me
became
just
kind
go
of
to
like
it since,
a blind for the divine feminine.
right?
There's the father, the mother, and the what? It would be some kind of in the tree of life terms, it would be Vina, which is the receptive Sephira
Hold on,
that
I'm
starts
just-
the process of differentiation.
I'm just pulling it up.
But she was more like a principle of wisdom than like a Mother Mary kind of
How do I get this thing?
personification.
Hold on. Here we go.
You see hints of this in the standard translation that we ended up with of Genesis, which is just really interesting. That's apparently an excerpt, and it's very
Okay, so
distilled.
here we go.
Okay.
At the beginning, there's only the one, which is the monad, the invisible spirit of the Father of all. So now what happens with this is now we have this entity Barbello, okay, who ends up, the one is absorbing its reflection in the living water of the cosmos, and that creates Barbello, which is the feminine. However, it's not even clear here. It could be the feminine could be the father. There's actually some masculine aspects of Barbello, okay, but Barbello is the second aspect, and then she requests 4 powers from the one and is given these 4 powers: foreknowledge, incorruptibility, eternal life, and truth. And then she self-generates the child of light, which requests a power from the one and is given mind. Okay, this we believe is the savior, is the Christos. Okay, now the light produces 4 luminaries, and each of the luminaries has 3 aeons for 12 total. And so Barbello and the one bring the light, help the light to bring forth. So that's the 3: Barbello, the one, and the light bring forth the primal man, which is Garadamos, which looks remarkably like Adam. And he in turn has a son, Seth, who rules over the fullness or the second eternal realm. So this is in a totally separate realm where these aeons reside. Okay, not the realm, which is the realm of Barbello, the one, and the light.
But I think there's different levels to it, and
That's what's going on. And then Sophia is one of these, the last of the 12 eons, and helps the offspring in doing a lot of the stuff. So there's 2 worlds: the visible world around us that is mortal, composite, always changing, and then there's the world of the forms. This is clearly influenced by Plato and the Greeks, which is where
he was influenced by.
Yeah, he was influenced the other way, but anyway, that's where these other entities are, is in this in simple, unchanging, intelligible world of forms, okay? And the soul craves to be free of these bodily endeavors and reach this world of the forms. And the body moves in the realm which has all the sense and perception, and the soul follows in both of these worlds, okay?
Any questions?
Yeah, and where is Yahweh in all of this?
He shows up. Hold on, you'll see.
Well, I think it works, like I
Sophia
said, in
here
the
brings
layers
forth a
and
new
levels.
creation of herself, but she does it without getting permission. Okay, Sophia does this. So she gives birth. She has enough of the one's power to give birth to this formless Yaldabaoth, okay, which is in fact the creator of the material cosmos, okay, and notice that this Yaldabaoth is not directly connected to the one. It's through Sophia, and so he's really ignorant of the spiritual, or she, of the spiritual realms of the fullness that lie above them. So Sophia hides Yaldabaoth in this lower sphere of existence, and he looks around and looks down and he sees this abyss, and he creates this world, which is the world around us, which is flawed because he doesn't understand what he's doing. So it's a progression from the very top down to less and less perfection.
And less unity and more differentiation. But even when you read Genesis, there's that kind of process going on. And you can, it's parallel to the four worlds in Kabbalah.
Right.
The first it happens as a thought in your head, then it's a feeling, then there's all these different stages of the process that sound like the same thing starting over again, but it's starting on a different level.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I don't get is if you have both Jewish and Christian Gnostics, this seems like the height of sacrilegious belief. So I don't understand how it would be tied to Judaism or Christianity.
Well, that's what no one knows, but apparently this was a very popular creation myth. That's what he cited, this archbishop in 180 AD in Lyon, in Gaul, in France, was writing about this and trying to get rid of it. And this was circulating around in the Mediterranean, and it was apparently quite popular.
It later became, kind of verboten. It was taboo, just like the idea that it's against, the rules of Judaism to say the name of God. That's only to the profane. The initiates say the name of God all day long. That's what they do. They recite Yud He Vav He with different vowel sounds, depending on the energy centers that they're working on. So it's really for the profane that they say that it's forbidden. And
So is that why we're considered an unsacred planet?
I would say one.
A sacred plane, sacred, higher dimension.
Higher dimension.
But I think a lot of what has come down to us is very, very watered down and reductive, and simplistic. And that's what these texts are showing, that this was decided arbitrarily at the Council of Nicaea, and like 90% of everything was thrown away.
Well, and then
And
they
all we
butchered
got was-
everybody that believed in the stuff that got thrown away.
They killed all these people. I mean, how,
And
where's
they-
that? Where's the,
all the temples
wisdom
were
or love
destroyed
or-
of anything remotely backing this.
and they kept like one toe of this whole body of knowledge that has been discounted and destroyed. So
But-
that's what's so revolutionary with these texts being translated now, so we can see more of what the original ideas were.
It
And they
could
were
very
pretty
well be.
far out, you know.
It could be in the Vatican libraries. We
I'm
don't know.
sure it is.
Yeah,
I'm sure
don't
it
know.
is.
So,
Their cellars go on for, you know, miles and miles and miles underground. But it's, you know, it's just, you know, it's like all the priests and bishops, the higher up you go, the more they know him, the more esoteric knowledge they have. They know astrology. They know that symbolism is all over their texts. It's all over the Book of Kells. You know, but they act as if it's forbidden. That's just because they don't want the average person getting that knowledge, because it could be dangerous and it could be empowering. And they want to be in this patriarchal power structure. So that's why they've created this, you know, this myth that it's evil. What they're doing is evil, but the knowledge goes way, way back. And that's just what these texts are being, you know, exhumed from these caves is showing, that this was the real knowledge that was nearly destroyed with the Council of Nicaea, which was this political thing. There was nothing pure about their motives. There was nothing philosophical or spiritual or religious in their decisions.
yeah, the Council of Nicaea, remember, was suggested by Constantine the Emperor. Now, Constantine could see that the Roman nobility was still following the Roman gods, but the soldiers who made up the legions were all becoming Christians, and they weren't following the Roman gods. He had no control over it. So he convened this thing so he could take over the Christianity. And in fact, what he did in 327, this isn't really that well known, was he made the Archbishop of Rome be the one that approved who the next emperors were. So all the emperors from 327 on were all approved by the Archbishop of Rome. That's why Charlemagne in 800 AD became Holy Roman Empire emperor. He was made that emperor by the Archbishop of Rome, by the Pope. That's why Napoleon, when he became Emperor of France, he had the Pope doing this. It's all due to Constantine doing these things. So it was entirely a power play. So anyway.
One last question.
Our minister has looked at a lot of this. Our former minister, who I believe was just brilliant. You know, but there are books like Constantine's Sword that's all about this.
Yeah.
You know, so we're not making this up. It's not some new age thing that we just, you know, are making up off the top of our heads. He read Elaine Pagel's cover to cover for decades.
Yeah, Steve, what's your question?
What was the remark about the nature of sexism becoming, you know, part of the regular order of things? He said that was Yahweh's.
Well, yeah, the Yadabal, all of a sudden, apparently women were on the same level as men. And all of a sudden he said, no, I'm a man and I'm going to be the chief honcho and women will be subservient to me.
Are we speaking about Yahweh here?
What?
Are we speaking about Yahweh is the one?
Yeah, Yaldabaoth
Is a precursor.
is the precursor to Yahweh.
He's like a prototype.
Yeah.
Okay. And these entities had a male and female forms to them, whatever.
But yeah, that's where the translation breaks down. They're not clear about the, you know, there's different gender when you use words in other languages. There's separate cases for male and female, and
Yeah, the original Hebrew
he,
Bible,
she,
God
it.
wasn't
Yeah.
a he.
Yeah, the original Hebrew Bible in the Torah was appears to be female. So So anyway,
Might there have been an evolution of the one being originally spoken of and then later migrating to Yahweh?
yes,
Yes.
but through that chain.
But Yahweh wasn't like the primordial.
The others
God.
were there first. That's what this myth says.
Well,
And
it,
I've
it,
read this in a lot of sources for the past 30 years, different things about this. It's not just one.
It's not just the Apocrypha of John. There's other
Right.
places where this appears.
it makes me wonder, about the age-old question of how can a fair and just and loving God allow all of this evil to happen? And the answer is, this was, an evil God, not the, the loving, fair God, which one would presume would be the one. And then that would beg the question is, well, where's the one? Why isn't the one doing something?
Right.
Right.
I'm more comfortable with the idea of the one being, both and neither, or beyond good and evil. When you look at creation, when you look at the world, or my concepts of good and evil anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So it's,
Look,
but it's worth looking into on your own. We're just trying to do a little
but we're
gloss
trying to
here.
expose you to this. There's a huge amount of work that's been carried out trying to sort these things out, and they contradict one another. It's not clear.
But these are very serious scholars coming out of, Greece and Israel and Europe and the United States. These people are poring over these ancient
For
texts
decades.
and having their minds blown.
Yeah. So
Well, part of the Hebrew text of daily prayer is something like the Lord our God, the Lord is one. I don't know whether that is referring to the one, but that's
But
part
that's
of the daily text.
That's the Shema, but it's referring to the Elohim, right? Shema Israel, Adonai Elohim, Adonai Ahad. Ahad means is one, but the Elohim is plural and feminine.
yeah.
In Hebrew. So that's a really deep statement with many interpretations. And they spend hours and hours and hours dissecting this in in real classrooms and discussions for years. But the Elohim is, I think of it as like this committee of yentas that does make these decisions of well, let's add a little of this and a little of that, we'll make him nice like this, and oh, she'll like him if he's got long legs. They're making these designs and plans for the universe. It seems realistic to me, but there's for each of the sephirah on the tree of life that we were looking at, each one has a name for God, for the divine. They're different aspects of the divine. So it's not just one thing, and it's certainly not just this, Father God. That was the usurpation.
Okay.
So I think we made things less clear than ever.
You can read the handout, and then we can draw family trees when they get done. So what we're going to just go to now on the science side of things, we've stayed clear of biology, and this is an attempt to touch on it. Just a sec, I went the wrong way. Can I go back? Yeah, here we go. when we look at Western medicine, that to me tends to be looking at things related to surgery, which is really mechanical engineering, trying to understand how to put things back together, cut, saw, whatever. And we also have the pharma side of things with biochemistry, trying to come up with vaccines or drugs of various sorts to go after things. So what's not there is anything related to the innate electricity of the body. So for example, if I simply had what's called a magnetometer, I can sense magnetic fields, and you had that close to your chest, you'd see that the muscles that are there driving the heart they're driven by currents, electrical currents. Electrical currents generate magnetic fields, and there's a strong magnetic field right around your heart, very well known. So there's three different things I just want to touch on here. One is acupuncture, which is really taking advantage of electrical current flow. And then we'll go into something called bioelectricity, which is much deeper, but it is building on that. And finally, chakras, which lead to things that are even more deep. So let's see where this goes. So the first thing in traditional Chinese medicine was, and this is true today, is that they have maps showing meridians and covering the body, and when I can touch something here and it links up to something up here. So how in the world could this possibly how could this possibly work? Well, it turns out that your body is actually, as an organ of your body, this is the skin, and the skin is actually a conductor of electricity. It's not a great conductor, but it does the job. And so if I put a little needle in here, it generates a little surge, which can make it all the way up here to some other organ, and it really works. And the Chinese have used this for centuries, for millennia, and doing this for trying to control and deal with illnesses. So you'll find all kinds of instruments now out there that are there, but there still is this tried and true, just putting these needles in and having things happen. So this is Eastern medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, built on, again, real electric current flows that will stimulate. And the idea is to get the organs to come back into sync, that they're out of sync with their natural functioning. And so it's a realization that the body by itself can heal itself. And why should we try and do anything other than aid the body in trying to do this? So let's go on from this. We go back to the 1930s, and Harold Burr, who was at Yale, started looking at these things and discovered there was, again, something that he called an L field, or some sort of electromagnetic field. And it determined the shape, okay, and the shape of the person. And he developed all of these things here. And there's a book that I cited here and so forth. So he felt that this could predict the growth of the body and disease of the body. And he thought there was something called the energy of the body. And so he started these things. So then what happened? Then we have a book that came out in 1985, but it summarized decades of research, and it looked at salamanders and frogs. And Becker was in a hospital outside of Syracuse, Veterans Administration Hospital, and also I think it was State University of New York at Syracuse was eventually there, and he was dealing with things related to limb amputation and trying to regenerate these things. And so he started to look at the electric potentials in various parts of the body during this regeneration process, and you have to go back in time into the 40s and 50s, that you attaching electrodes and measuring these potentials was something that was just, incredibly crude then compared with what we have today, because today we have oscilloscopes and we have probes that are far more easy to operate and don't screw up the measurements all by themselves. He was doing this stuff with what today would be considered junk, but it was amazing what he did. So he took a look at he cut the limb of a salamander or frog off, and he looked at the voltage at the cut, and he saw it was roughly minus 10 millivolts up to plus 20 millivolts or so. And so he started to look at this, and the voltages would change back to the normal level in about 4 weeks or so. And then there was no limb regeneration that would take place. But in the salamander, that could take place. In the salamander, the first 2 weeks, things would change, and then they'd normalize, and then the limb would be all regenerated, okay? So he started looking at this, trying to figure out what in the world he could do. And he discovered that he could inject currents into the wound when these things were going on there. And this would stimulate or get the body to heal itself. And in other parts of this book, he had example after example. There was just a multi-decade long research program where he did all this work and discovered that, for example, he measured the resistance for the acupuncture charts, and concluded that this was entirely, electrical. The instrumentation got to be better and better. And he had different people that he worked on that he actually helped to heal, to stimulate their regeneration. So he had one guy who showed up on crutches with this really mangled leg, and Becker applied some electrodes to it over a period of months with different levels of currents and different waveforms. And after a year, this guy was running without any crutches whatsoever. He was everything had healed to the extent that he could go do this. So the problem that he faced was that Becker would submit research proposals, and they would get reviewed by his peers. Well, his peers would say, this is all very interesting stuff, but we deal with pharma. We go deal with drugs, and this has nothing to do with drugs. So I think it's interesting, but I wouldn't fund it. And you have to have a vote by your peers approving this to get approval for your funding. So eventually he just gave up and threw the towel in the late 80s. But he did write this book that you can look at to see what he did. Now there's a new individual, Michael Levin, who's I think he's Russian, but he's now at Tufts University, and he followed up on this. So what Michael received from Paul Allen, who's one of the co-founders of Microsoft, was a $10 million grant, which is being renewed for him to pursue whatever he wants to pursue. So what Michael observed was the following, that we have cells in our body, and the cells have a membrane to them. If you put electrodes on either side of the membrane, you'll see voltages of, say, from minus 20 millivolts to plus 50 millivolts, those sorts of changes. So every cell in your body, and you have 50 trillion, 70 trillion cells in your body, and the cells get renewed every day, those cells have an electrical potential. And when you look at the electrical potential, the cells themselves are alive, so they move around. So the electric field you're dealing with is not simply DC, it's an AC electric field. It oscillates, it functions in different ways at different times. And in particular, when you're injured, that electric field behaves in a very different way than when you're not injured. So the idea here is what in the world could you end up doing to do this. So I'm going to cut here to a video by Michael Levin, and you can judge for yourself what you think of him. Let's see, I'm going to go back to this. Hold on one sec. We've been here before. I'm going to get out of, wait. Sorry about that. I'm just going to pull up. This is all on our website, so you can, see it.
This is a wonderful index of videos and
Okay, here we go.
resources.
So this is Michael Levin in an interview. You can judge for yourself.
Mike, welcome. It's good to see you. I'm excited for this conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
So most of us have this mental model in biology that DNA is a property of every living thing, that it is kind of the software that builds the hardware of our body. That's how a lot of us think about this. That model leaves too many deep mysteries. Can you share with us some of those mysteries, and also what tadpoles have to do with it?
Sure. Yeah, I'd like to give you another perspective on this problem. So one of the things that DNA does is specify the hardware of each cell. So the DNA tells every cell what proteins it's supposed to have. And so when you have tadpoles, for example, you see the kind of thing that most people think is sort of a progressive unrolling of the genome. Specific genes turn on and off. And a tadpole, as it becomes a frog, has to rearrange its face. So the eyes, the nostrils, the jaws, everything has to move. And one way to think about it used to be that, well, you have a sort of hardwired set of movements where all of these things move around and then you get your frog. But actually, a few years ago, we found a pretty amazing phenomenon, which is that if you make so-called Picasso frogs, so these are tadpoles where the jaws might be off to the side, the eyes are up here, the nostrils are moved, so everything is shifted. These tadpoles make largely normal frog faces. Now, this is amazing because all of the organs start off in abnormal positions, and yet they still end up making a pretty good frog face. And so what it turns out is that this system, like many living systems, is not a hardwired set of movements, but actually works to reduce the error between what's going on now and what it knows is a correct frog face configuration. This kind of decision-making that involves flexible responses to new circumstances, in other contexts, we would call this intelligence. And so what we need to understand now is not only the mechanisms by which these cells execute their movements and gene expression and so on, but we really have to understand the information flow. How do these cells cooperate with each other to build something large and to stop building when that specific structure is created? And these kinds of computations, not just the mechanisms, but the computations are of anatomical control for the future of biology.
And so I guess the traditional model is that somehow cells are sending biochemical signals to each other that allow development to happen, the smart way. But do you think there is something else at work? What is that?
Well, cells certainly do communicate biochemically and via physical forces, but there's something else that's going on that's extremely interesting. And that is that it's basically called bioelectricity, non-neural bioelectricity. So it turns out that all cells, not just nerves, but all cells in your body communicate with each other using electrical signals. And what you're seeing here is a time-lapse video that for the first time, we are now able to eavesdrop on all of the electrical conversations that the cells are having with each other. So think about this. We're now watching, this is an early frog embryo. This is about 8 hours to 10 hours of development. And the colors are showing you actual electrical states that allows you to see all of the electrical software that's running on the genome-defined cellular hardware. And so these cells are basically communicating with each other who's going to be head, who's going to be tail, who's going to be left and right, and make eyes and brain and so on. And so it is this software that allows these living systems to achieve specific goals such as building an embryo or regenerating a limb for animals that do this. And the ability to see these electrical conversations gives us some really remarkable opportunities to target or to rewrite the goals towards which these living systems are operating.
Okay, so this is pretty radical. Let me see if I understand this. What you're saying is that when an organism starts to develop, as soon as the cell divides, electrical signals are shared between them. But as you get to a few hundred cells, that somehow these signals end up forming a kind of essentially like a computer program, a program that somehow includes all the information needed to tell that organism what its destiny is. Is that the right way to think about it?
Yes, quite. Basically, what happens is that these cells, by forming electrical networks, much like networks in the brain, they form electrical networks, and these networks process information, including pattern memories. They include representation of large-scale anatomical structures, where various organs will go, what the different axes of the animal, front and back, head and tail, are going to be. And these are literally held in the electrical circuits across large tissues, in the same way that brains hold other kinds of memories and learning.
So is this the right way to think about it? Because this seems to me such a big shift. I mean, when I first got a computer, I was in awe of the people who could kind of do so-called machine code, like the direct programming of individual bits in the computer. That was impossible for most mortals. To have a chance of controlling that computer, you'd have to program in a language, which was just a vastly simpler way of making big picture things happen. And if I understand you right, what you're saying is that most of biology today has sort of taken place trying to do the equivalent of machine code programming, of like understanding the biochemical signals between individual cells, when, wait a sec, holy crap, there's this language going on, this electrical language, which if you could understand that would give us a completely different set of insights into how organisms are developing. Is that metaphor basically right?
Yeah, this is exactly right. So if you think about the way programming was done in the 40s, in order to get your computer to do something different, you would physically have to shift the wires around. So you would have to go in there and rewire the hardware. You would have to interact with the hardware directly, and all of your strategies for manipulating that machine would be at the level of the hardware. The reason we have this now amazing technology revolution, information sciences and so on, is because computer science moved from a focus on the hardware onto understanding that if your hardware is good enough, and I'm going to tell you that biological hardware is absolutely good enough, then you can interact with your system not by tweaking or rewiring the hardware, but actually you can take a step back and give it stimuli or inputs the way that you would give to a reprogrammable computer, and cause the cellular network to do something completely different than it would otherwise have done. So this the ability to see these bioelectrical signals is giving us an entry point directly into the software that guides large-scale anatomy, which is a very different approach to medicine than to rewiring specific pathways inside of every cell.
And so in many ways, this is the amazingness of your work, is that you're starting to crack the code of these electrical signals, and you've got an amazing demonstration of this in these flatworms. Tell us what's going on here.
So this is a creature known as a planarian. They're flatworms. They're actually quite a complex creature. They have a true brain, lots of different organs, and so on. And the amazing thing about these planaria is that they are highly, highly regenerative. So if you cut it into pieces, in fact, over 200 pieces, every piece will rebuild exactly what's needed to make a perfect little worm. So think about that. This is a system where every single piece knows exactly what a correct planarian looks like and builds the right organs in the right places, and then stops. And that's one of the most amazing things about regeneration. So what we discovered is that if you cut it into 3 pieces and amputate the head and the tail, and you just take this middle fragment, which is what you see here, amazingly, there is an electrical gradient head to tail that's generated that tells the piece where the heads and the tails go, and in fact, how many heads or tails you're supposed to have. So what we learned to do is to manipulate this electrical gradient. And the important thing is that we don't apply electricity. What we do instead was we turn on and off the little transistors. They're actually ion channel proteins that every cell natively uses to set up this electrical state. And so now we have ways to turn them on and off. And when you do this, one of the things you can do is you can shift that circuit to a state that says, no, build two heads, or in fact, build no heads. And what you're seeing here are real worms that have either two or no heads that result from this, because that electrical map is what the cells are using to decide what to do. And so what you're seeing here are live two-headed worms. And having generated these, we did a completely crazy experiment. You take one of these two-headed worms and you chop off both heads and you leave just the normal middle fragment. Now, keep in mind, these animals have not been genomically edited. There's absolutely nothing different about their genomes. Their genomic sequence is completely wild type. So you amputate the heads, you've got a nice normal fragment, and then you ask in plain water, what is it going to do? And of course, the standard paradigm would say, well, if you've gotten rid of this ectopic extra tissue, the genome is not edited, so it should make a perfectly normal worm. And the amazing thing is that that is not what happens. These worms, when cut again and again, in the future, in plain water, they continue to regenerate as two-headed. Think about this. The pattern memory to which these animals will regenerate after damage has been permanently rewritten. And in fact, we can now write it back and send them back to being one-headed without any genomic editing. So this right here is telling you that the information structure that tells these worms how many heads they're supposed to have is not directly in the genome. It is in this additional bioelectric layer, probably many other things are as well. And we now have the ability to rewrite it. And that, of course, is the key definition of memory. It has to be stable, long-term stable, and it has to be rewritable. And we're now beginning to crack this morphogenetic code to ask, how is it that these tissues store a map of what to do, and how we can go in and rewrite that map to new outcomes.
I mean, that seems incredibly compelling evidence that there's, that DNA is just not controlling the actual final shape of these organisms. So there's this whole other thing going on. And boy, if you could crack that code, what else could that lead to? By the way, just look at these ones. What is life like for a two-headed flatworm? I mean, it seems like it's a kind of a trade-off. Like, the good news is you have this amazing three-dimensional view of the world, but the bad news is you have to poop through both of your mouths.
So the worms have these little tubes called pharynxes, and the tubes are sort of in the middle of the body, and they excrete through that. These animals are perfectly viable. They're completely happy, I think. The problem, however, is that the two heads don't cooperate all that well, and so they don't really eat very well. But if you manage to feed them by hand, they will go on forever. And in fact, you should know these worms are basically immortal. So these worms, because they are so highly regenerative, they have no age limit. And they're telling us that if we crack the secret of regeneration, which is not only growing new cells, but knowing when to stop. You see, this is absolutely crucial. If you can continue to exert this really profound control over the three-dimensional structures that the cells are working towards, you could defeat aging as well as traumatic injury and things like this. So one thing to keep in mind is that this ability to rewrite the large-scale anatomical structure of the body is not just some weird planarian trick. It's not just something that works in flatworms. So what you're seeing here is a tadpole with an eye and a gut. And what we've done is we've turned on very specific ion channels. So we basically just manipulated these little electrical transistors that are inside of cells. And we've imposed a state on some of these gut cells that's normally associated with building an eye. And as a result, what the cells do is they build an eye. These eyes are complete. They have optic nerve, lens, all the same retina, all the same stuff that an eye is supposed to have. They can see, by the way, out of these eyes. And what you're seeing here is that by triggering eye building subroutines in the physiological software of the body, you can very, very easily tell it to build a complex organ. And this is important for biomedicine because we don't know how to micromanage the construction of an eye. And I think it's going to be a really long time before we can really bottom up build things like eyes or hands and so on. But we don't need to, because the body already knows how to do it. And there are these subroutines that can be triggered by specific electrical patterns that we can find. And this is what we call cracking the bioelectric code. We can make eyes, we can make extra limbs. Here's one of our 5-legged tadpoles. We can make extra hearts. We're starting to crack the code to understand where are the subroutines in this software that we can trigger and build these complex organs long before we actually know how to micromanage the process at the cellular level.
So as you've started to get to learn this electrical layer and what it can do, you've been able to create, is it fair to say it's almost like a novel life form called a xenobot? Talk to me about xenobots.
Right. So this, if you think about this, this leads to a really strange prediction. If the cells are really willing to build towards a specific map, we could take genetically unaltered cells, and what you're seeing here is cells taken out of a frog body. They've coalesced in a way that asks them to re-envision their multicellularity. And what you see here is that when liberated from the rest of the body of the animal, they make these tiny little novel bodies that are, in terms of behavior, you can see they can move, they can run a maze. They're completely different from frogs or tadpoles. Frog cells, when asked to re-envision what kind of body they want to make, do something incredibly interesting. They use the hardware that their genetics gives them. For example, these little hairs, these little cilia that are normally used to redistribute mucus on the outside of a frog, those are genetically specified. But what these creatures did, because the cells are able to form novel kinds of bodies, they have figured out how to use these little cilia to instead row against the water and now have locomotion. So not only can they move around, but they can. And here what you're seeing is that these cells are coalescing together. Now they're starting to have conversations about what they were going to do. You can see here the flashes are these exchanges of information. Keep in mind, this is just skin. There is no nervous system. There is no brain. This is just skin. This is skin that has learned to make a new body and to explore its environment and move around. And they have spontaneous behaviors. You can see here where it's swimming down this maze. At this point, it decides to turn around and go back where it came from. So it has its own behavior. And this is a remarkable model system for several reasons. First of all, it shows us the amazing plasticity of cells that are genetically wild type. There's no genetic editing here. These are cells that are really prone to making some sort of functional body. The second thing, and this was done in collaboration with Josh Bongard's lab at UVM, they modeled the structure of these things and evolved it in a virtual world. So this is literally on a computer. They modeled it on a computer. So this is literally the only organism that I know of on the face of this planet whose evolution took place not in the biosphere of the Earth, but inside a computer. So the individual cells have an evolutionary history, but this organism has never existed before. And it was evolved in this virtual world. And then we went ahead and made it in the lab, and you can see this amazing plasticity. So this is not only for making useful machines. You can imagine now programming these to go out into the environment and collect toxins and clean up, or you can imagine ones made out of human cells that would go through your body and collect cancer cells, or reshape arthritic joints, deliver pro-regenerative compounds, all kinds of things. But not only these useful applications, this is an amazing sandbox for learning to communicate morphogenetic signals to cell collectives. So once we crack this, once we understand how these cells decide what to do, and then we're going to, of course, learn to rewrite that information, the next steps are great improvements in regenerative medicine, because we will then be able to tell cells to build healthy organs. And so this is now a really critical opportunity to learn to communicate with cell groups, not to micromanage them, not to force the hardware, but to communicate and rewrite the goals that these cells are trying to accomplish.
Well, it's mind-boggling stuff. Finally, Mike, give us just one other story about medicine that might be to come as you develop this understanding of how the bioelectric layer works.
Yeah, this is incredibly exciting, because if you think about it, most of the problems of biomedicine, so birth defects, degenerative disease, aging, traumatic injury, even cancer, all boil down to one thing. Cells are not building what you would like them to build. And so if we understood how to communicate with these collectives and really rewrite their target morphologies, we would be able to normalize tumors. We would be able to repair birth defects, induce regeneration of limbs and other organs. And these are things we have already done in frog models. And so now the next really exciting step is to take this into mammalian cells and to really turn this into the next generation of regenerative medicine, where we learn to address all of these biomedical needs by communicating with the cell collectives and rewriting their bioelectric pattern memories. And the final thing I'd like to say is that the importance of this field is not only for biomedicine. You see, this, as I started out by saying, this ability of cells in novel environments to build all kinds of things besides what their genome tells them is an example of intelligence. And biology has been intelligently solving problems long before brains came on the scene. And so this is also the beginnings of a new inspiration for machine learning that mimics the artificial intelligence of body cells, not just brains, for applications in computer intelligence.
Mike Levin, thank you for your extraordinary work and for sharing it so compellingly with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris.
Find it. Here it is. So we're jammed up on time here, as always. Probably what we should do is do a rerun of this thing next time, since there's so much material here. We'll go back and revisit the Gnostic side of things. Probably a good exercise is to take a look at the handout and draw a little tree showing who's on first, who's the one, you know, where does Barbello come in, where in the world is the Eons and Sophia, where is Yaldabaoth, you know, so just keeping track of those things would be a good way. There's other YouTube videos on Gnosticism. I deliberately chose the most difficult one, which is the Apocryphon of John, because this is the most amazing to me of all the Gnostic writings that people have come up with. There's a different creation myth, there's a different view of things, and this has been completely suppressed, as near as I could tell, until these Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi surfaced. But that's one thing we can do, is go review it, and then I can go back through some more stuff. Not only there's a couple of other videos by Mike Levin. I just gave you a taste of one, but we can also go back and touch on the chakras, which we didn't do. And what goes with it is, I always wondered what Jesus of Nazareth, how he was able to heal all of these people in the time. If you read the Gospels in the New Testament, there were hundreds of people that he healed. And in fact, when the Romans brought charges against him, they didn't mention this at all. It wasn't in doubt. They couldn't disprove it. All these people were sick and were made well just by coming close to him. The one that I remember the most was Lazarus. He was told that Lazarus, his friend, was dying, and that he should come. Now he knew that it was a 2-day walk to get to Lazarus. And as soon as he was told this, he immediately said, "Oh, Lazarus is dead." So Lazarus he knew he was dead. He walked for 2 days. He went there and asked, Lazarus had been put into a cave of some sort, a mausoleum, and he asked him to step forth, and Lazarus stepped forth. So somehow, being 2 days walk away, he was able to bring Lazarus back to life. And this work that Mike Levin is working on is the only thing I can possibly think of that he could somehow, you know, end up causing this sort of regeneration, but over this distance and with these electric fields. So we'll go through some of this stuff some more, because I think it's an interesting intersection of where all these things come together, and it's clearly mystical. No one, you know,
It was some kind of energy here.
You saw what happened with this guy Gary Becker, who was very competent researcher and yet was completely blackballed for doing, no one disputed the work was good work, but they just said, oh, we don't do this. Okay. So this is what I always thought we could get out of with on Star Trek. They had a diagnostic tool. They just kind of
Right.
ran it over you,
Scam.
and they immediately came up with the root cause of what in world you were ill, and this would suggest, you know, not only would you have the root cause diagnosed, but you'd be able to in fact cure it. But you know, that's not for today. It's just, you know, this is speculation suggesting where a thing could go.
It's been said that Jesus was using Kabbalah somehow. That he was a master Kabbalist, and that's how he was doing the healing. I wanted to propose, if I may, a suggested assignment if people want to try it. Obviously, there's no penalty if you don't, but I wanted to see what kinds of connections other people would draw between part 1 and part 2 of tonight's class.
Yeah, we dealt with the Gnostic, the Apocryphon of John, and here we're dealing with the body electric, this morphogenic electric field that ends up allowing you to create life. So something to think about.
You can do all the research you want. You can work off the top of your head if you want.
There's a lot of stuff on the website. You can go look at what we posted on the website. If that'll give you any ideas. So,
But I'd be interested to know what kinds of people, what kinds of connections people come up with.
Yep.
It's a kind of assignment I would like to do if I have.
Well,
time.
that's why Marjorie's going to do it, and then we're all going to grade Marjorie. See,
That's good.
never don't do anything that you can't do.
I think I could spend 10 years on it. That's the
Right,
thing.
right.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be able to stop the generation.
So, okay, I'm going to wrap it up here, and we'll go at it again next week. We've done 20 classes so far on our second go around. So,
Oh, well, excellent. Thank you.
okay,
Good
more
night.
to
Thank you.
follow.
Good
Okay,
night.
bye-bye.
Good night. Take care, everyone.
You too.